Have you pitched your book idea to a publisher at a conference and been told you need a bigger platform? And then you ask your author friends what to do first, and they say, you need to start an email list. Or perhaps you're sitting right now with your published book in hand and wondering, how can I get more people to know about my book? It can be so frustrating, right? We have a God-given message and we know He wants us to share it with others. But it's exhausting running the rat race, fighting an algorithm, and trying to market your message without feeling gross. There has to be a better way, y'all, right? And indeed, there is. Today, I want to talk about why you might want to host a podcast to build your author platform. We often rush to the how, but if we don't know our why, we're not going to be very motivated to spend any time on the how of podcasting. So why would you want to start a podcast? Let's dive into 7 reasons today for you to consider. Hey y'all, I'm Kim, host of Book Marketing Mania, and I'm so thrilled you're tuning in today to learn how to build your audience and market your book on podcast. Now, let's go through 7 reasons why you might want to start a podcast. Number 1, you want to start creating content to serve your future readers. I know that's one of the reasons I started my show 2.5 years ago. I just wanted to get online and help writers build their platforms and market their books. But I'm not much of a writer myself, so podcasting was a perfect fit for me. It's content I create once, but it lives forever, and I can share it and it can be found for years to come. Unlike social media, but that's a story for another day. I love that podcasting is a way to provide content for readers on the go. We're all busy, we're all multitasking, and a podcast fits right into our lifestyle. I know I listen while doing the dishes, while walking the dog, while exercising. Okay, I don't do much of that, but when I do. While in my car, driving back and forth to pick up my son. I remember a couple of months ago, I was thrifting at Goodwill, and I suddenly heard the voice of Ed Milet, a podcaster I'm a huge fan of. Just down the aisle from me was a sweet young woman listening to his podcast while shopping. Now, she did have Bluetooth earbuds in, and I think she just popped one out for a moment, and that's when I heard Ed's voice. And if you know his show, those few minutes were such a blessing to anybody in that store that day, including myself. And it was a fun way to connect and share our love for podcasts. So consider whether hosting a podcast might be the way for you to start creating consistent content to serve your future readers. A second reason why you might want to start a podcast is you want to grow an audience without it taking time away from writing your book. It takes less time than social media to host a podcast because you're not battling algorithms and what's trending today versus yesterday. Hosting a podcast takes less time than blogging if you're adding in the work of SEO so people can actually find and read your blogs, like we talked about on episode 108 with Leanne Fox. And if you're already blogging, you can easily embed your podcast episodes into your blog. So now your blog readers have a choice. They can either read your blog post or listen to the blog post on your podcast right there on your website. Hosting a podcast, especially an audio podcast, takes less time than producing a video on YouTube if you're not crazy about being on camera and you spend time stressing about your hair, your makeup, your lighting, and your background. Not that you can't do a video podcast, but if those things are getting in your way, an audio podcast might be a better way of, using your time wisely. And recording a podcast takes less time so you can get back to writing that book God laid on your heart. If you do it all strategically, so you use your time and resources right. And we'll be talking about that a lot in the coming episodes. Now, a third reason why you might want to start a podcast is to build and grow your email list. Whether you've heard you need to start an email list, you need a bigger email list, you then have to have a way to tell your target readers about your email list, right? So they'll sign up and you can start nurturing them. I remember working with several traditionally published authors who wrote for a large ministry, and their words were read by millions of people worldwide. And I was always hounding them to make sure they offered a freebie in their post to grow their list because they were getting all this traffic to their words. And why not convert that traffic over to their email list so they can keep nurturing these people? And because lo and behold, every time we got to their book launch, we were always wishing we had started earlier to grow their email list so they had more people to tell about the book so they could in turn help more people with their God-given message. And so with a podcast, you have a weekly opportunity to do that. And we're going to talk about that too on the show soon. So before we get to the fourth reason, if this list is hitting home for you and you're ready to talk about the how of podcasting, be sure to hit follow here in your podcast player on the show so you don't miss an upcoming episode. Can't wait to share all about podcasting as a host with you in the coming episodes. So now, a fourth reason why you might want to start a podcast is to show prospective agents and publishers, or even yourself as a self-publisher, that you have a plan to market your book long before it releases and long after. And that plan starts now with a podcast. On episode 85, I shared what I learned from my guest and other podcasts on what literary agents want to see in your book proposal to show you have a plan to market your future book. And again, it starts now, y'all. It's never too early to start marketing and serving your future readers. Then a fifth reason why you might want to start a podcast is to establish and nurture relationships with podcast hosts for future collaborations. If you are pitching yourself to guest on podcast, you might have better luck landing interviews when you can ask the host to be your guest first. And on episode 68, I talked to Rebecca George, host of Radical Radiance, about her experience pitching and guesting, and also the impact hosting a podcast had on building her platform and later launching her first book through collaborations. So be sure and check out episode 68 if you haven't listened to it yet. Then a sixth reason why you might want to start a podcast is to test out and create content for your book. All those book and chapter ideas you have swirling around in your head, they can be put to good use on a podcast. You can test out ideas and see how your listeners respond to know what's going to make the cut to be put into your book. And on episode 19, Crystal Prophet shared how she published her first book using content from her podcast. And I also remember way back at my very first She Speaks conference, Emily P. Freeman was sharing about how she went from blog to book because she had done just that with her blog long before podcasts were a thing. Then a seventh reason why you might want to start a podcast is to have content to answer the most frequently asked questions of your readers. Do you get a lot of the same questions on social media? You could point them to a podcast episode. Do you get a lot of the same questions from your readers after finishing a chapter of your book? You could point them to a podcast episode. And maybe you have an online course as a supplement to your book. You could point your readers to podcast episodes that go even deeper or supplement that course module's topic. That's one of my favorite ways I've seen people use podcasts. And whoa, y'all. Okay, I know that's a lot of reasons why you might want to start a podcast. And the super cool thing is that it's not one size fits all. There are lots of ways to host a podcast, and I shared them all on episode 72. And podcasting doesn't have to be as difficult as others make it out to be. So if you're thinking, okay, I can relate to one of these reasons why for starting a podcast, and now I want to know how, what are my first steps? And that's exactly what we're going to be talking about next week. So thanks for tuning in. As always, I'll be there for you next week to help you build your audience and market your book one podcast at a time. See you then.